What is your darkest family secret? My great uncle was born from his sister being raped by her father. The family said basically she had just been a loose lady and not right in the head. They locked her up in the attic. After my great uncle passed, my mother and I went into the multi-generation house to clean it out. The door to the attic, where sister/mom was kept, but long since passed. The door had an outside lock. No creepy claw marks or anything. But it was just so sad. My mom pulled the lock off and announced to the house that she would never be shut away again. Thank you to your mom for doing that. My grandfather was killed in a bar when my father was still a toddler. The official story was that he was murdered over a pinball game. Back then pinball was pretty serious, I guess. It wasn't until recently my grandmother confessed, on her deathbed, that my grandfather actually killed someone and buried the body days before his own demise. So he was actually killed in retaliation for a murder that he committed. My grandmother kept this secret for almost 65 years. When my mother was still young, my grandfather found out she had a boyfriend. He shot her BF dead, and then they killed my grandfather because of it. It's sort of weird thinking about the fact that if your grandfather hadn't killed that guy, your mother might not have met your father and you might not have existed. A male blood relative went to prison for drug dealing and major theft. Whilst in prison he was diagnosed with Hep C, likely from sharing needles. When he got out of prison, he raped his 13-year-old stepdaughter. There's a high likelihood that he raped his other daughters. One died from a drug overdose and the other committed suicide. I sighed. He died in prison from Hep C complications and liver cancer. Answer. A not too distant cousin fucked over his notoriously dangerous bookie gang in a big way, including forcing himself on someone's wife and stealing a high-up's motorbike, and has been on the run for the last 20 years. Yes, he actually may not be alive anymore. Have you ever filed a missing persons report for him? He could be a dose somewhere. It's me. My dad never told his family I existed. I was shameful. Maybe he was more ashamed. After he died they found out about me and kindly asked me not to come to the funeral. I get why he never told them. I worked in our benefits. The wife of a deceased employee came in to complete the form she needed to get his death benefits. She was stunned to know that he had left one of the life insurance policies to a woman she didn't know. On relationship, he listed the unknown woman as daughter. I felt bad for the wife to learn that her husband had been unfaithful, but on the flip side glad that the deceased had remembered his daughter. I once borrowed my granddad's video camera for a trip. He said he put a fresh tape in the camera for me and gave me a backup. I was like 12 at the time and into filming stuff. BC I wanted to be a director. Get back from the trip, rewind the tape and review the footage. Low light in a room I didn't recognize. Two people, one laying down, another to the side, bobbing her. Oh my god, my grandparents made a porno and granny was blowing papa. I told my dad what I saw. We never spoke of it, and they have no idea I know. Papa took that secret to the grave with him 3 years ago, and I got the king decades to live with that scar now. I'm really sorry that you had to see your grandparents in this state, but it's kind of wholesome compared to the other stuff on this thread. There was, I assume, consent between a married couple, but for you, yeah, that sucks. Oh, for sure. My family doesn't have a whole lot of dark stuff, but this one was more of my own dark secret from the rest of them. I'd assume it was consensual. They were high school sweethearts, married before papa went off to Vietnam, etc. Had 30 plus years of marriage under their belt. So hey, good on him for keeping the spark alive. For me, yeah, can't unsee it, lol. My dad gave a job to a cousin. I remember as a kid that this cousin I'd never heard of just suddenly popped up out of nowhere without explanation, but I was a kid so didn't really think of it. But everyone made a big deal out of how great it was for my dad to give him a job. I found out 20 years later that the cousin had been in prison for having a sexual relationship with a student. Edited for clarity. My friend was a superintendent and a teacher in the 80s. It was the norm. Still was through the 90s. He said he remembers teachers popping Adderall too to get through school. Kids were preyed on so much then. Can confirm. CL Buttoff 1990. Had a 40-year-old teacher marry a classmate a month after we graduated. We all suspected something was going on. Had 2 buddies that bragged about getting BJs from the 25-year-old hot, married, new teacher. As part of opening a home daycare, mom found somebody on the sex offender registry with our family's very unusual last name. Mom called grandpa. He confirmed that he is related to us. He hadn't seen him in decades. He didn't know he had been convicted for statutory, but thought that sounded about right. We are not supposed to ask about him again. Good for your grandpa keeping dangerous people away from his family, even if they are related to him. That's the right thing to do, and too many stories on here are unfortunately because people did the opposite. A year or 2 after her adoptive mother died, my mom went looking for information about her birth parents and found that her birth mom and her husband had been gruesomely murdered by a drug cartel. There was an article about their murder in Rolling Stone magazine that had gory pictures of their bodies. Must have been really shocking to her. Hope she's well now. Definitely shocking and upsetting for her. She did manage to get in contact with her birth father though, and they have a close relationship now where they keep in touch regularly. He happens to live in the same state as us, and she goes to see him and his family every now and then. I found out 6 months before my dad died that he was a heroin addict earlier in his life. He was dying of liver disease and tried to overdose one night. I didn't live with him at the time, but knew something was wrong, and that's when my mom and I went and found him on the floor of his bathroom with a needle in his arm. My dad, before he met my mom, was a heroin addict and got clean. Years later he was diagnosed with Hep C, which developed into liver cancer. He commented that if he could he would just odd, so he could just go to sleep and not wake up. I wouldn't take it as a relapse, just a way to end the pain. That's exactly how my dad died. Liver cancer, caused by hepatitis C, from needle use as a teen. The Hep C stayed dormant until he was 47, and he died when he was 48. He grew a tumor on his liver and had cirrhosis, and the tumor burst one night, landing him in the hospital and starting his almost year-long battle with liver cancer. He had used heroin as a teenager, but had quit cold turkey and went to school and made a life. Met my mom and got married, and after 10 years of trying, had me. I was 16 when he died, and an only child. He never said anything about ending his life though. He had insisted that my mom and he raised me while completely substance free, since he knew how even alcohol can ruin lives and wanted me to have a better life than he had had. He was such a good dad. When he was 12, he was kicked out of the house by his mother. His mom was an artist and model, and more concerned with dating men and partying than raising her 2 sons. She was quite wealthy, as was the man she was married to at the time. So they got my dad his own apartment and furnished it completely. He remembered that she remarked she was such a good mother because she even got him a toothbrush, didn't forget a thing, and then they left him, a 12-year-old boy, to live his own life. He, struggling with abandonment, and suddenly the entirety of the world opened to him. Still went to school, tried, didn't tell anyone. Eventually he fell into the wrong crowd, following men who he probably saw as father figures, since he didn't have one himself. That's how he got addicted to heroin, and even went to jail once for breaking and entering. It was then he realized that he didn't want to waste his life. He said he put a loaded needle of heroin on his bedside and stared at it. As he went through days of withdrawal, I knew that the only way I could beat it was if my resolve to quit was greater than the power it had over me. He told me before he died, as he told me about his early life, something I had been completely unaware of up until that point. He was stronger than the drug, and he did beat it. And then he got a job and put himself through college, met my mom, and got married less than a year later. They were married just about 20 years when he died. They were still very much in love. Years later, I would ask my mother why my grandmother had kicked my dad out, but let the other son, who is handicapped, stay. Apparently, rumor had been that she didn't want to get pregnant and had tried to abort the baby herself, which resulted in his mental handicap, and that sort of makes sense when I think about it, because he doesn't have Down syndrome or any diagnosable issue. He is just slow. I'd describe him as a 7-year-old child mentally, in a body somewhere between a man and a kid. Apparently, just before he was a teen, some doctor she had seen wanted to experiment with hormone therapy, as he hypothesized that he would never be able to have a relationship and would grow sexually frustrated, potentially posing a risk to people. The boy hadn't even developed yet, nor shown interest in anything even remotely sexual, but it seems this doctor wanted a guinea pig. So during puberty, he was given hormones to ensure he didn't develop. His genitals never grew beyond that of a little kid. So he is very much a child, in an oversized body, no facial hair to speak of, just quite literally an oversized child. Apparently she felt guilty for what she had done, trying to abort him, and failing, so she kept him. He was easy to lock away in a room, while she did whatever and whoever she wanted. But my dad was much more strong-willed, and posed a threat to her lifestyle, hence sending him to live alone. Once he turned 20, my dad wanted to find his birth father, who he had known until his parents divorced around age 6 or 7. He did research and figured out where he lived. He went to his door and knocked, and when the door opened, he said, "Dad, remember me, it's your son." His father looked at him for a moment, before saying, "I have a new family now, you're not my son." He closed the door in my dad's face, and they never spoke again. I've never told anyone any of this before. It's kind of an insane story. It makes me understand why my dad got into drugs and such though, and admire him so much for being able to quit and make a life for himself. My mother had a likewise horrific childhood. I can't even imagine going through a fraction of what they went through, and I didn't know about one bit of it until I was much older, having been the most loved, cherished, spoiled child I know. I miss him every day, and I know you must too with your father. May they rest in peace. No one in my family can give me a honest answer on how many siblings I have. Same. My father is 72, and I'm early 20s. He has about 8 kids that I know of. The youngest is 15 and the oldest is 49. My brother from my mother's side recently said he ran into my sister from my father's side. I had no idea who she was. Most of the family members I ask just say they've lost track. Edit. It definitely doesn't seem like a cultural thing, since we live in NSW, Australia. Edit. Turns out the sister he ran into was actually my cousin who just looks a heck of a lot like my half-sister. Which is ironic, since she's the only one I know who is biracial, as her mother is Thai. Her dad's a massive hoe lol. One family member killed another by leaving a bag of poison donuts on the front steps. We are now hesitant about accepting donuts. Where do you live with such frivolous donut dispersion? That's what I wondered. Me. I rarely get offered donuts. I had an uncle who moved far away, worked in a boiler room at a huge casino, decades ago. He was always sketchy, and he had way more money than a simple boiler room employee ought to have had. Rumors that the boiler room was a really useful thing for the mob, due to boilers doubling as incinerators for certain purposes. Hence the money. Many unanswered questions there. Guess it's kinda obvious that your uncle got paid to look the other way while the mob used the boiler room to cook their pizzas. I want him thin crust. My great-grandfather shot and killed a man in his grocery store back in the 30s over a poker game. He ran a speakeasy out of the back of his store and lost almost $2K, so as the guy was walking out the front after the store closed he shot him and got away with it by telling the police the man robbed him. It wasn't until he was on his deathbed he told my grandfather what had happened. Edit. This was in Ohio. My great-grandfather was shot and killed over a poker game. Did this happen in Mississippi perchance? It was in Ohio, unfortunately. I learned my disabled great-aunt was raped multiple times while she was in high school, including by a teacher, and it resulted in at least 3 pregnancies that she was forced to carry and give up for adoption, and then shamed for. I found out because I did 23andMe and found cousins my dad couldn't explain, so there was a very awful phone call to understand why disabled women are at the highest risk for sexual assault. I'm so sorry, as someone with a disabled sister. That's always been one of my biggest fears, and I didn't even know about the statistics. The world is such a scary place. In the film Driving Miss Daisy, when the chauffeur played by Morgan Freeman, is driving Miss Daisy to worship service. They get stuck in a traffic jam. He gets out to see what the holdup is. When he gets back in, he says, "You won't be going to service today. Somebody done bombed the temple. Hebrew Benevolent Congregation Temple, Atlanta, 1958. She says, "What? Who would do such a thing?" "My uncle." "That's who. Wasn't everyone acquitted in this case? Did your uncle ever admit to doing the bombing? Was he the main suspect?" "Sorry. That's a lot of questions. He was one of the 5 men arrested, but not the one tried and acquitted twice. I don't know if he ever confessed, but he was definitely the black sheep of the otherwise normal family. My dad, his sisters, and my other uncle rarely mentioned him, at least not while my cousins and I were around. But when I was little, I remember one of my older cousins saying something about my uncle and a church bombing. I thought better of asking dad about it, and basically forgot about it. Then, a few years ago, Elle was listening to the Missed in History podcast, and they did an episode on the bombing. When they listed the names of the men that were arrested, a giant light bulb went off in my head. My grandma has been having an affair with a family friend's husband for 28 years. Damn. What does your grandma do to family enemies? That's a lifetime of lies and betrayal. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe for more videos.